A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said to his disciples, "As the Father loves me, so I also love you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love." I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy might be complete. This is my commandment: love one another as I love you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I no longer call you slaves, because a slave does not know what his master is doing. I have called you friends, because I have told you everything I have heard from my Father. It was not you who chose me, but I who chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. This I command you: love one another. The Gospel of the Lord. 40 years ago, back in 1975, I began my studies to prepare me for a career in the field of medicine. And I remember back then people telling me about the sacrifice that I would need to make if I chose that profession, and they were right. I remember the sacrifices that I had to make, the stresses, the times away from my family. But when I would feel sorry for myself, I could read about others in my profession who had things worse than I did. And so I could read about missionary doctors like Albert Schweitzer, who had to put up with the same stresses or worse, far away from the comforts of home. And I could read about doctors like Walter Reed, who had to dedicate their whole careers to the fighting of a single disease. And then recently I read about a doctor whose name was Dr. Sam Brisbane. And his story took place in the country of Liberia. Now, for those who aren't familiar with it, Liberia is a little tiny country on the west coast of Africa, and it was established in the 19th century primarily by liberated American slaves, so it got the name Liberia. And it's always had a very strong American connection. The capital of Liberia is named Monrovia, after our 5th president, James Monroe, and English is the official language, and most of the population are followers of Christ. And in 1939, Samuel S. Brisbane was born in a little city in Liberia, and the city was named Royersville. And as he grew up, he decided that it was his calling to be a member of the medical profession. And pursuing that wasn't easy because there weren't any medical schools in Liberia at that time. And so he had to go abroad, and he studied medicine in Germany. And in 1970, he returned to Liberia to practice medicine. And so for years he practiced, and back then Liberia was a pretty prosperous country. There was a lot of foreign investment, and Dr. Brisbane himself was pretty prosperous. He got married, he had 8 children, they adopted 6 more. But in 1989, the country kind of fell apart. there was a civil war that began, and it lasted for 14 years, and by the time it was over, hundreds of thousands of people either died or were driven into exile. And Dr. Brisbane became so afraid for the safety of his family, he sent them abroad to live, and most of them came to the United States. But he himself stayed in Liberia. He continued to treat people. And his family didn't hear from him for a long time, and for a while they thought he was dead. But as it turns out, the rebels saw how valuable he was, if to nobody else, to them, and so they spared his life. And finally, in 2003, the fighting ended, and by then Dr. Brisbane was in his 60s, and he went to work as the director of the emergency department at the nation's largest hospital, the John F. Kennedy Memorial Medical Center in Monrovia. And he had his own health problems. He had back problems that forced him sometimes to treat people when he was sitting in a wheelchair. And he continued to practice, but he looked forward to the day that he could retire. And so he bought a coffee plantation outside of town. And it was his dream that one day his family could return to Liberia and they could live together on that plantation. And in 2013, he entertained a medical delegation from Indiana University, and they came to discuss with him disaster preparedness. And he showed them the facilities at the JFK hospital, and he showed them how unprepared the facility was for a disaster. The economy was still very bad, and the hospital didn't have enough gowns and gloves, and it didn't even have enough soap, and the power went out every once in a while. And he told the delegation about how afraid he was of a natural disaster. And then the following year, disaster happened. People crossed over into Liberia from the neighboring country of Guinea, and those people were infected by the Ebola virus. And Ebola spread through Liberia, and people started showing up at the hospitals with Ebola. And when that happened, panic set in. Sometimes the whole nursing staff of the hospital would walk away from the job. And Dr. Brisbane was in the emergency department, which was right on the front lines. They would see enormous numbers of people, and they had no idea who had Ebola. But Dr. Brisbane stayed on the job. He held off on his retirement. And sometimes when people who were thought to possibly have Ebola showed up, he would insist on taking care of them himself. And in July of 2014, he developed a fever himself, and for 2 days he tried to take care of it himself. He just stayed home, but he got sicker and sicker, and he had to go to the hospital. And on July 25th of last year, of 2014, his family got the news that Dr. Brisbane himself had died of the Ebola virus. And he was buried on that little coffee plantation that he once had planned for his retirement. And his family held a memorial service at a United Methodist church in the States. And people like me might not ever have heard about Dr. Brisbane, except 2 of those delegates from Indiana University who had visited with him, got to know him, wrote a eulogy that told of his life and his death. And in September of this year, the eulogy was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and so medical professionals throughout our nation could read about this brave, dedicated doctor from this little tiny country who had sacrificed so much. He sacrificed his security and the companionship of his family and his retirement, and in the end he sacrificed his life so that the people of his homeland, the people of Liberia, might have life. And if you read the paper today, you will see that today, May 9th, 2015, the World Health Organization has declared that Liberia is Ebola-free. horrible disease has been conquered in this country. And if we ask ourselves, how could that happen? Well, we can turn to the words of today's gospel. Christ tells of love, the greatest love, the love that would lead people to lay down their lives for their friends. And we see how through that sacrifice, Dr. Brisbane and countless others, sacrificing pretty much everything for the well-being of the country, the disease was eliminated from Liberia. And today we hear the command of Christ to his disciples, the command that today comes to us. Love one another. One command for all of our encounters in life, great and small. And to love each other, not just a little, not just a lot. To love each other as Christ loved us, the essence of love. To bring the love of Christ to every human encounter. And we know how tough that can be. So we pray to the Spirit for guidance. But when the going really gets tough, we can think about, we can read about, we can tell others about those great examples in our midst, those people who have sacrificed so much, their time and their treasure and their comfort and their security, and like Dr. Brisbane, their very lives out of love for others. And to take today's example, 8 months ago we were able to read Dr. Brisbane's eulogy, the eulogy to him, and today we hear that this horrible disease that we heard so much about, that ravaged Liberia worse than any other outbreak in any other country in history, it's been eliminated. And we can see the power that love has in our world. And we can know the power that it has in our lives. Alone, together, it gives us the ability in this life to do all that is good. And in the fullness of eternity, that same power will lead us to be with the eternal source of love.